Welcome to the WCA webinar, Advancing Broadband in Wisconsin, Considerations and Approaches. Our guests today include Tom Asp of Power System Engineering and Jim Weichert of Power System Engineering, as well as Jack Votava of Forward Analytics. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. We have, if you have any questions, I encourage you to type them in the chat section or the Q&A section. If you have called in, you can hit *9, and at that point, you can, Anne-Marie will unmute you, and you can go from there. So at this point, I'm gonna pass it on to my colleague, Jack Votava, who's got a few comments on broadband, and then we will get started. Jack, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Michelle, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I just wanted to highlight the Wisconsin County Association and Forward Analytics upcoming report on broadband access in rural Wisconsin, which is set to be released by the end of this month. To kind of contextualize the need for thinking and strategies we'll discuss in this webinar, I just wanted to very briefly highlight some of that report's findings. Specifically, about 25% of rural Wisconsinites do not have access to an internet plan currently of at least 25 megabytes per second, which is the FCC's current standard for modern broadband access, which puts Wisconsin behind other states at number 36 for rural broadband access. So obviously, as the pandemic has highlighted, there's an urgent need for us to do better. And in that spirit, I want to turn things back over to Michelle for the body of our webinar.
Thank you, Jack. And Jim, I believe you're going to kick things off here for us. So I'm going to hand it off to Jim Weichert.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. And as Michelle said, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jim Weichert. I'm the Vice President of Automation and Communications at Power System Engineering. Tom Asp, who will be leading much of the discussion today, leads up our communications group. We'll be talking specifically about how broadband applies in Wisconsin and how counties can help to support their region. So one of the things I really like about conversations like today is that even though Tom has over 15 years of experience helping folks to deploy and enhance their broadband network, there's always more to learn, and everyone has different perspectives. So PSE is an engineering firm. We are headquartered in Wisconsin, but we have offices throughout the Midwest. We've been around for 45 years, supporting utilities and government entities across the Midwest. So certainly, we have a long-term investment and have worked with a lot of folks here in Wisconsin and the Midwest. Our specialties are broad, so they range from communications and automation to system planning, design, rates, and forecasting. But today we're going to focus on one of the specialty areas, which is broadband planning. And so we can move on to the next slide here. Certainly, broadband is a progression. And so, and as Jack had mentioned, it's on the minds of many. And certainly broadband is fantastic when it's able to kind of facilitate strong communities. So certainly, it's an equalizing technology. It's empowering when it can both help to facilitate education and commerce. It's really great, but certainly there are challenges in deploying it, especially to some of our more rural areas. So certainly is very relevant as Governor Evers and Chairperson Bach of the Public Service Commission announced again just recently the opening of the 2021 Broadband Expansion Grant. More opportunities to help facilitate those who are expanding broadband in the areas. And certainly, as we'll be talking about here, expansion of broadband really is a long-term investment. So whether you're exploring broadband within your region or trying to expand availability, or you have a system that's operating and trying to help to facilitate a more affordable system, regardless, there are lessons that we can learn from each other. So everyone's at different places, and even within a particular county, as we'll be talking about, folks are at different places in different regions. And so really trying to put the pieces together. PSE's approach, certainly as we consider broadband, like other types of infrastructure that we've been planning, really is with the intent on the importance of long-term. So certainly taking a long-term perspective and for the long-term good of your citizens, the long-term good of economic development, of the investment that you're making, because certainly the investments that we're talking about with broadband and the return on those investments are ones that ones that need to be planned out well, really because of the long-term perspective. and also to the relationship and partnerships that we're looking at. So with that, what I'm going to do is hand it over to Tom. As Michelle had mentioned, feel free to insert questions into the chat. I'll do my best to field those and insert them at times where Tom can answer them. So thanks, and Tom, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, appreciate it, and thanks for the intro, Jim. And like we talked about, I really want to concentrate on kind of talking about, kind of an overview of some of the pressures that we're seeing, and really kind of gets down to what do we really mean by high performing, affordable, and reliable broadband? Because it really kind of, there's a lot of conditions into that. Jack had mentioned, that 25% of the rural area does not have access to 25 megabit or more. And, so is 25 meg enough, or do we really want to see 100 meg, or going up to a gig? And then when we start getting into affordable, is it an equalization of rates across the, from a rural area to the urban area? Is it affordable in terms of one's income and a variety of other factors? So it really gets a lot of subjective discussion around what does high performing, affordable and reliable really mean. And so a lot of the discussion today is kind of centered around talking about that and what does it look like in certain spots of the state today. And so some of the things that we'll talk about is want to look at what are some of the challenges across the country. What are some of the challenges faced in providing broadband to different areas, and especially into the rural areas? And what are some of the technology alternatives? And then talk a little bit about some of the entities that are actually supporting some rural broadband, some of the challenges that they have, and then also talking about then going into some of the unique impacts of the counties, and talk about some of the potential roles that the counties may play onto it, and then just general key considerations. And when we're taking a look at it, there's a huge variability across the state from county to county on what the conditions really look like. And to start, the Wisconsin Broadband Office and their map is actually a great starting point onto that, because you can look at each of your given counties. You can take a look at what services are reported where, who's providing the services, and really kind of get a good overview sense of what the situation really looks like. But there are some real nuances that you do want to really take a hard look at, because one of the things that first of all, the data here is based on the FCC Form 477 data, which sometimes overstates the availability, because the providers voluntarily provide information to the FCC each year on a census block basis. And if they provide a service in one location in that given census block, that census block will be reported to have 100% coverage. And so it tends to overstate coverage in a lot of cases onto that. So there's some mechanisms coming out, new reporting requirements that the FCC is going to start requiring next year, providers that will start helping provide a little bit more detailed onto it, but it's still kind of the best information that we have to deal with without going kind of a site-by-site survey at this point in time. But I think it's important to note where on this map, this is based on the state is saying, here's the eligible grant areas for the 2021 PSC grants, and they have served, underserved, and unserved areas. And if you look at the served areas, there's just along the eastern and western portions of the state, and then the southern part around Madison, that are really the white areas that they're calling it served. And then the underserved areas, actually you can see that, when we dig into it, we'll see that some of the underserved areas are actually have 1 gigabit service available, but it's only one provider that's being, so they have a definition of underserved being kind of based on the number of providers. So in order to be served, you have to have, a services from at least 2 providers that are providing 25 megabits per second or more, onto it. And so if we dig into a little bit more detail, and it kind of focused in on the kind of contrast between Douglas and Bayfield counties here, because when you first take a look at it with the FCC or the PSC definitions, they look pretty similar. Each of them have some served area, but it's pretty small. And with the bulk of the area being called underserved, and that kind of the lighter blue, and then the unserved area being the a darker blue onto that. And so, when we first take a look at it, it actually looks pretty similar. However, we really want to take a look at some of the more of the details behind here to really kind of tell what the story is. And so when I take a look at it at the providers, and now I'm looking at the wireline providers and the fixed wireless providers. And so when we look at it, where I can see now also the majority of the Bayfield County is showing that they have a service of greater than 25 megabits per second. And when we dig into this further, we'll see that there's a provider that actually in Bayfield County and also the far eastern portion of Douglas County, there's actually a fiber to the premises product that's available, and you can get up to a gigabit speed there, but there is only a single provider, and that's why you're seeing that being called, underserved in the PSC definition. And so if you look at the areas that were considered to be served, that was up in that far northeastern corner, and that happens to be where you have a wireless provider that is also providing a service that is greater than 25 megabits per second. And that's why you see where you see that white portion is you're seeing that overlap of where you have the fiber to the premise provider and the wireless provider providing those coverage areas. And so that's why you got to be really careful of taking a look and saying, what does the situation really look like? Because when we look at Douglas County, if we look at the eligibility areas, it really looked very similar to Bayfield, but Douglas County has a lot more coverage issues than Bayfield County. Douglas County is primarily served by CenturyLink and primarily based on a DSL service. You have a lot of the county that you can't even get a 3 megabit service. A lot of the county is served, a lot of the locations are served by about a 10 megabit per second DSL service, and some of the others, the lighter blue, that you're getting up to 25 meg with the DSL service, but again, it's pretty spotty on the coverage. And the areas that you're seeing, kind of the lighter blue, the 10 to 24 and the 3 to 10 services in the Bayfield County, that happens to be CenturyLink service area as well. So really take a look at kind of the difference that those two service providers make. And so here again is showing kind of where the Bayfield County, much of the county is served with a local telephone cooperative that has been able to leverage Universal Service Fund money over the years, and they've actually invested into a fiber architecture and actually will provide full up to 1 gigabit services today onto that. So from an availability standpoint, Bayfield is quite well served. But then when you look at from a competitive standpoint, that's where the PSC is kind of saying that saying that it's actually underserved as well. And so when you kind of flip back to the kind of the areas of eligibility service on the eligible areas versus the for grants versus uneligible areas, again, they look pretty similar, but you really have to want to take a look at that another layer below that onto that. Now take a little bit of a break here and see if there's any questions at this point.
Tom, hi, can you hear me? Did I unmute myself okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. There was one question that was posed from Michael Bubb. He is in Taylor County, which is kind of north central Wisconsin, and he was saying that we're going to build a middle mile network to attract ISP providers to our county. So they're doing that middle mile. But how do we get grant money to build our network without an ISP provider at this point? So, you know, if they're looking for grant money to build that middle mile but don't yet have the ISP, are there things that they can pursue that you're aware of?
Yeah, and I'd have to take a little look into the PSC grant in a little bit more detail. I've just started going through that to see if they will actually award middle mile projects. I believe they're looking at having it more tied to the making sure that you're tying it to serving a given location. And so I think with the PSC grants, you're probably going to have to have a relationship with an ISP onto that. Back in about 2008, 2009 timeframe, the federal government did some of the early VTOP grants that were based on middle mile projects. But to date, any of the federal dollars and federal grants, whether it be the Reconnect grants or the upcoming RDOF auctions, they're all looking at you have to have that in service as part of the offering in order to get a grant.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so certainly one of the challenges. Tom, there's another question that was asked, and that is, can existing copper be upgraded to meet the 25 megabit bandwidth standard, or is fiber needed to reach that speed? And maybe even beyond that question, what are the technologies I think that might meet that in future speeds?
Yeah, and I'll kind of go into those a little bit more in detail later here. But when we look at the copper plant getting above 25 meg has proven to be pretty tricky. You can get DSL services, approaching 50 megabits per second. You do have to have a pretty good, very copper plant that's in very good condition. You also have to be careful of how far you are from what we call the DSLAM equipment or the central office. But typically in the rural areas, the further you get away from the central office location, the speeds will deteriorate pretty quickly. And so that's one of the challenges that you see in the rural areas. And kind of in particular, taking a look in Douglas County, you can kind of see the distance sensitivity where the DSL service will drop off quite quickly. That's where you see some of the wireless providers are actually being able to get up into that 50 megabit per range speeds better than some of the DSL providers onto that.
That sounds good, Tom. And then just a follow-up to the first question, and then we'll let you kind of proceed on. So certainly one of the challenges, you're also aware, the ISP providers to kind of get these grants are, the question is, problem is the ISP providers only want to support areas with more than 10 customers per mile, right? So that certainly is the challenge. And ISP providers kind of want the network first. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. So certainly, anything you can speak to that. And certainly I know we've talked in the past about kind of taking steps with wireless providers and helping you to leverage to get some of that initial network, and then getting that cash flow and building more into fiber might be things. But anyhow, the question is, what do you do when the ISP provider really wants that 10 customers per mile, and that becomes kind of a first step?
Well, I think that's a great question. It really gets into it. I got some cost slides here that show one of the challenges that the ISPs are really facing. For example, if you look at Bayfield County, they're actually at about 4 customers per mile of line from the electric cooperative there, and that's some of the data that we have from them. And so it is a very sparse county. The telephone cooperative there, Norvado, is built out Bayfield County based on a lot of the federal Universal Service Fund dollars that they were eligible for, because they're the incumbent local exchange carrier. And so they had a funding mechanism that enabled them to build out fiber in that low density area. But for an ISP that's coming in and saying, wanting to come in and build into like the CenturyLink territory and all that, you're looking at some very extremely high cost to build fiber. And without some grant money, it's really difficult to make a business case to build out there. And that's why the grant money is so critical on some of these areas to get service.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tom.
Yep. So, you know, and part of that is you kind of wanting to take a step back and saying, hey, why do we see such a big difference between the variations from county to county? And, you know, almost the, you know, to help identify how we might be able to address this, I think it's kind of nice to take a look and saying, you know, how did we get here? And I think a lot of the issues really came and stem from the Telecom Act of 1996. And that's when the federal, when the feds through the FCC really kind of started taking a look and said, yeah, broadband is going to be important, but it's not a utility. And we're really not going to put a lot of regulation. We're going to really leave broadband up to the marketplace in order to, you know, to build out service. And what we've seen is broadband since then, it really has become an essential service, and it's really replaced, you know, back in '96, it was really before the big boom on the telephone service where we saw the, you know, the mobile telephone service really take over the voice market. And we've seen the landline market really kind of dry up. But broadband, you know, has really become that essential service for, you know, every household, but it's not regulated as a utility. And so is in the case of like the landline telephone, we had it where the providers, you'd have a, you know, like a CenturyTel or Norvato would come out and they had an obligation to serve that entire service area. And regardless of what it cost them to connect a given customer, they had to go out and connect that customer. They were, you know, but in return, they were given this monopoly service area where they really didn't have a competition for that service. And then their pricing and everything was regulated by the public service commissions. And so you had a situation where, like with landline telephone, you got to the point, even in the more remote areas, you had telephone service. And a lot of the real high cost areas to build were covered with funds from the Universal Service Fund. And so if you look at your telephone bill or your cell phone bill today, you'll see that line on the USF funds. And that's where a lot of the money came in to build out the telephone service. But you don't have that with broadband. And so broadband really has really limited oversight, you know, unlike the cable and the landline telephone business. And so the cable television, when you look at where a company like a Charter and Comcast, you know, they're regulated via franchise agreement within the local community. And within that franchise agreement, not only do they have to make a payment based of a certain percentage of all the cable TV revenues to the local government, they have also an obligation to serve everybody within that regulated franchise area. So in these towns and cities, since they have an obligation to provide cable television under their franchise, they're in fact having to serve and provide broadband there. But when you get out more of in the rural areas, you know, you're dependent on, you have the ILECs like CenturyLink and CenturyTel building out the copper infrastructure and supporting the telephone. The telephone is kind of marginal on its ability to support broadband as the broadband speeds have continued to rise. But those companies still have a fair amount of lobbying power and lobbying effort within the FCC and the federal government. And so they've been really slow to rise those service levels. And that's one of the reasons why you see that 25 meg is kind of the minimum standard, because you can still, a DSL circuit can still support that. Whereas many of us would argue that a 50 or 100 megabit service really should be that kind of the low end service that's considered to be served or not served. So it really kind of gets into a lot of the issue is based on how we decided to regulate the broadband industry 20 some years ago. Then when you start taking a look at one of the other issues is, really how do you define broadband, and how do you define some availability and performance and reliability and affordability? When you look at availability, is it good enough to have a single provider, or do you need multiple providers? Is there affordability? Do you tie in affordability into the definition of availability? Because in some cases you can take a look and saying, yes, we can get this service, but it's 10 times higher price here in the rural areas than is in the city. Does that mean it's, yeah, it could be available, but is it affordable? And so you have a lot of kind of intermixing of these questions on saying how well served are you or not served. Then performance, like I said a little bit earlier, I think 100 megabits is probably a more appropriate measure than the FCC's definition of 25 meg, but that 25 megabit definition is really driven by the DSL thresholds that are being able to be supported. And then when you get into the affordability, it's really a lot of questions on, what's this digital inclusion? Do you have some type of mechanisms to make sure it's available regardless of household income? A lot of other factors there. And then you look at also kind of what's the difference of pricing in the city versus the rural type areas. And so if we look at, one of the challenges here is there's really no single definition across them. If you take a look at the Wisconsin PSE definitions and you look at the federal definitions, there's similarities, but there's a lot of subtlety differences, onto it. Whereas the PSC here in Wisconsin is taking a look and saying, we want to see at least 2 providers with the definition of availability, whereas the FCC is just looking at a single provider in that part of the definition. So it's, and one of the questions is that really a fair assessment to have in that definition or not? So there's a lot of issues, challenges according to these different definitions here. But if we look at the affordability and jump back to Bayfield County again, there's considerable difference between what Norvado offers on pricing compared to what, like, say, TDS does on the east side of Madison. And for example, TDS, you're getting a gigabit service with 1 gigabit down, 400 megabit up at an intro price of about $90, jumping up to $112 after the first 2-year contract. Whereas a 1 gigabit down, 100 megabit up in Bayfield County is about $200 a month. So it's about a 2-to-1 difference on that pricing. And you see that same thing going down to where the TDS, their low end package is 300 meg, whereas that's about Norvado for a 300 meg product is almost, 2.5 times that price. So you do see a very big difference between the rural pricing and kind of more of the urban market pricing. And maybe stop for a second and see if there's any questions at this point.
Yeah, you bet. Tom, thanks. There's a couple of that have come in. So one I'll just tee up. There was a question about Starlink and would that impact broadband access and grants? And I did mention that we'll be kind of getting to that, but maybe just take a second and you can respond to that, and then there's a couple other questions that I'll tee up for you here too.
Yeah, and I think Starlink, one of the things you'll have to take a look at is what are some of the latency and other types of requirements that the grant availability will be looking at. The upcoming federal RDOF grants, Starlink did a very heavy lobbying with the FCC to get them to consider to be the preferred level of service. That would be a gigabit service with under 40 milliseconds of latency. The FCC kind of, since, in theory, Starlink should be able to meet that, but they decided, since it's not proven, that it would not be eligible for the highest level of preferential treatment at the same level like the fiber to the premises would be offered. But to back up for a second, is, Starlink is actually what we call a low Earth orbiting satellite system. It's being funded by Elon Musk on his, and what they're in the process of putting up, it's a little over 12,000 satellites that are under on a low Earth orbit at about 1,000 feet, about 1,000 miles, and it offers a lot higher speeds than the current type of satellite systems, and it has a lot lower latency. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit more in detail, but it's something, if it does work, it has that ability to really turn this whole rural broadband access pretty well upside down. Because if it delivers what they're promising, it would offer something that is a competitive solution that really is offering something well above, in that 100 megabit price, 100 megabits downstream at a fairly low latency, where you're going to be able to do interactive type of services and those type of things, which you can't do on the geostationary satellite services today. So it's one to kind of keep an eye on, and it's one that will be really unfolding here in the next 6 to 18 months.
Perfect. That's good. Thanks, Tom. And yeah, lots of good questions. So thank you, everyone. I'll do my best to get to all of them. There were a couple of, one talking about someone who is in just outside of Sheboygan, so a smaller town of Mitchell, but outside of what would otherwise be an area that's reasonably populated, and so they were talking about reaching out to cable companies. So probably the cable companies are providing reasonable service in the area, but certainly not able to get them into their area. Just not enough customers in their area. So thoughts about what you can do when you're kind of outside of that sweet spot. And then there's another question about kind of, when how can you get more specific information beyond the 477 data on what coverage is in a particular area? This person happened to be in a portion of rural Dane County.
Yeah, and some of the kind of multiple questions in there. I think with the cable company on getting to expand out beyond their footprint, that's really kind of looking at what would you need to do to help change the economics, on that. And there's two ways, I think, in taking a look at it. One is through what's the cost to build, and how could you substantially decrease that cost? And that's where really a lot of the grants type of thing could fit into. And maybe the situation is working with them on helping to capture some of the opportunities under like the Wisconsin grants or some of the federal grants, if there's another round of those after the RDOF. But also looking at where we've seen some discussion of some counties looking at saying, is there some type of little bit of seed money or grants that the county could offer, and incentives the county could also offer to help offset some of the cost to build as well. So I think there's looking at those. Another way to it's kind of the opposite side, it's on the demand side. Is there some mechanism where you can help show the demand and kind of show that, saying, yeah, you're used to getting, maybe this type of take rate in the areas that, in the service areas that you are, but maybe if you charge a $10 a month premium or a $20 a month premium, maybe you can show that there's demand sufficient enough, and maybe trying to encourage through kind of is there ways that you could help encourage more of a higher adoption to help change the economics? And it really gets down to, fundamentally, it really gets down from a provider standpoint, it gets down to economics. Can they make a reasonable rate of return with the given risk that they have to make this pay? And a potential other way would be to taking a look and saying, is there ways to kind of, we can learn more about some of the Starlink and some of these other types of offerings, and maybe educating the public a little bit more of what are some of the range of the options that might exist.
That sounds good. There was a question that came in about, and I've got maybe another 4 questions queued up here. So thank you, everyone. Actually 5. So thank you for all the questions, and I'll do my best to pose them in. And probably what we'll do as well is, depending, we might open. We'll reserve time for folks so that we've honored everyone's schedule for any questions we haven't gotten to at the end, and let people stay on if they'd like to. But in particular, the one I'm looking at right now, since broadband has limited government oversight, how can we find out what service provider plans are for an area? So, if you don't know what kind of the service providers might be thinking, they don't seem to want to disclose the plans. Would the FCC have this type of information?
Yeah, the FCC right now today does not, because all the providers are required to provide the FCC is, on the 477 data, which does not give any type of pricing, and it just gives them, they have a classification of what type of service, what type of technology you're doing, and what's the maximum speed that you have. And it's not any, the granularity just is not there. And like you said, the service providers are not really upfront on providing details outside of their marketing pieces, and they're making their marketing a little bit harder to find information unless they confirm that you're actually a resident or somebody that is looking to acquire a service, and they're trying to protect their competitive situation. And that's one of the big challenges on really trying to find out information. And one of the ways that potentially you could do is maybe sitting down with each of the providers and maybe saying, how could you kind of play a role in helping educate your citizens? And, if you just tried to have a one-on-one meeting with them, would they be willing to disclose some of that information if they know that you're not going to be doing it from a competitive standpoint? But that's really on a case-by-case basis. But that is, frankly, one of the biggest challenges here on really trying to assess what is really the situation out there, because it is not publicly available information.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to let you, I'll try to tee up other questions here and collect them, but I'll let you kind of continue on here just so we can do a good job covering the material. And again, thank you, everyone. These are really good questions.
Yeah, no, this is great. And so, some of the challenges when you're talking about, we've talked a little bit about these things, when we're looking at, in the some new broadband entrants, some of the challenges that they would have from an economic standpoint is there is a mix of available when you're in the city and town. You do have some cable modem, you got a range of business providers, you have some DSL that's more on the higher performing, and it's a wireless, you do have wireless alternatives there. And so you really are in a fight for a market share. And then when you get out into the rural ones, you really have kind of the two pieces. You have the emerging alternatives, and especially the low Earth orbiting satellite systems, and then the overall cost to build. And the cost to build, when we get into fiber, and these couple of slides really kind of, there was a question, one of the earlier questions, is on the economics and the cost to build out in the areas. And these are some what we call the cost per passing for outside fiber plant. And this is what it would cost not to connect the customer, but just to run the fiber in front of each of the premises in the service area. And we have a couple of one county example here that was down in Kentucky that we did a cost estimate for, and that was sitting at $7,600 a passing. And so what that meant is just that outside plant with no electronics, no drop cost, no electronics in the house, you were spending $7,600 on just to run the fiber by that facility. And that was probably more in that situation where I think there were about 3 or 4 customers per mile of line in this case. And another Midwest, more rural area here, this example was about 4,000. And I think that was probably about 14, 15 customers per mile of line, onto that one. Whereas if you move into more in the cities, you're seeing, $800 to $900 a passing. And so when we get out in the rural areas, it really is a cost issue on how do you build, even if you get a fairly high percentage of a take rate, you have that huge investment right up front to try to recover over that term. And when we look at the cost, you can really see it is very much a cost of the density, because if I take a look at that Midwest county at $7,600 and say this West Coast suburban at this $1,300, the fifth one in, if I take a look and saying the cost of building in that West Coast urban was about $325,000 a mile to build out the fiber, compared to about an average of $75,000 per mile in the Midwest county. But the Midwest county example here, the one in Kentucky, you had a density passings per mile, which was considerably lower than the one in the urban area. So you take it as very much the cost of the fiber to the premises is very much dependent upon the density of, how many potential customers per mile of line. And that really is kind of what's really driving, that cost of building on fiber. And that's the challenge in the rural areas. And that's why I think grants and changing the economics is really the key to get other alternatives out there, especially the fiber to the premises based alternatives. Then when you look at what are the different technologies, existing right now, we have the DSL services, and they're primarily done by the independent incumbent local telephone carriers, and they're pretty much trying to push their copper and keep their copper plants going as long as possible. I think we've talked a little bit earlier is the DSL services, you start getting above 25 meg, it really comes marginal in order to support that. Long-term, really breaking that 50 to 100 meg barrier, you're probably not going to see that with DSL, and which means you're really going to be wanting to look at some type of wireless, or maybe one of these potential, some of the emerging satellite services onto that. But from an existing standpoint, you do see some rural counties, if they're served by a rural telephone cooperative, you'll see some pretty good footprints like we saw in Bayfield County. They're going to tend to be a little bit higher price than what the normal, what you would see in the urban type areas, but you're going to be able to get some robust gigabit speeds off of their plants. The satellite, the geostationary satellites, you can get satellite service pretty much anywhere. If you got a clear sky, you might have to, a given resident might have to cut down a tree or two to get that view. But the problem with the satellite, with the geosatellite systems, is you got a built-in about a half a second latency because your satellite, you're trying to hit a satellite that's about 22,000 miles in the air, and the propagation of that radio signal just takes that round trip. It's about a half a second. You have a fair amount of terrestrial fixed wireless services that are out there. And where you'll see the issues is really kind of the trees and terrain is always the challenge with the fixed wireless. I think some of the emerging technologies that can have an impact in some of the rural areas, there's a new frequency band that was just auctioned off. We call this Citizens Band Radio Service, or CBRS. It has a higher power output than some of the other alternatives that the wireless providers have had to use. And so I think that's going to give potential wireless ISPs some alternatives to have a little bit larger footprint. But I think one of the more, and then of course you have the 5G. The 5G, there are some 5G is not just left up to, it's not millimeter, the real high frequency. There are 5G frequencies down in the 700 megahertz and in the mid 300s. That will actually provide some good propagation in the rural areas. And you're seeing carriers like T-Mobile getting a lot more aggressive, offering fixed wireless services that are designed for the rural areas. And they're supporting about a $50 a month service for about a 50 megabit service. And you're seeing those in some of the more non-rugged areas at first, but you're going to see T-Mobile and some of the carriers slowly kind of build out more rural areas with the 5G technology there. But one of the ones that are really going to be very interesting to see is what's going to happen with the LEO, or the low Earth orbiting satellites. We had that question earlier about Starlink. And what Starlink is, it's funded by SpaceX, and they're planning to put over 12,000 satellites, and they're promising seeing up to gigabit speed with under a 40 millisecond service. They haven't published any pricing, but they are aggressively starting to test them. They just last week, they put up enough satellites where they feel that they're within 70% of having 24/7 coverage. And once that starts, they're going to be looking to start rolling out more commercial services. And they are doing some pilots. If you go out on their website, you can sign up for it to be a test system. And but any of their service plans, rollout plans are still kept pretty close to the vest. But it is one that if you're interested in reaching out, I think it's worth kind of reaching out to Starlink and seeing, what their plans are, and maybe is there some type of role that you could help, provide information to your citizens, and maybe doing some test sites to see if it actually is going to function or not function. So it's one that if it does work, it has that potential to really change some of the options that are there. When I look at some of the strengths and weaknesses here of the people that may be looking at building out, you have the telephone providers. They do have they do have that obligation to serve, so they're going to be serving pretty much every area in the county. They have access to universal service funds. They have access to expertise, economies of scale. But if they're really looking at trying to continue their copper plant, they're going to really struggle on meeting some of the higher capacity demands. Whereas if some of the co-ops have used the universal service fund money a lot more effectively, and actually have built out fiber to the premises already. So that's one of the first things to check on, seeing who your incumbent ILEC is. We're also seeing some of the electric utilities jump in the business and be providers. And I think one of the advantages electric utilities have is they have a lot of assets they can leverage. They have experience with line crews. You can look at securing financing through electric revenues. And they do have a need to leverage fiber with their the fiber with their electric needs, and they can allocate and they can cover a certain amount of cost on a fiber investment that like a telephone company or a county or another entity would not be able to justify. And kind of an example of the allocations, and this is a co-op down in Indiana where they were looking at, and this is kind of looking at a simple payback type of piece, and they were looking at rolling out fiber to the premises to 100% of their membership. And they looked over time, they're seeing about in year 8 is where the total cash inflows of the business projections would match the cash outflows. So it actually looked at a pretty good, it's a pretty good forecast, and shows a pretty good positive rate of return on that type of thing. But this is after allocations. And if you looked at the fiber investment, and you did not allocate any of the fiber outside plant or expenses, and you wanted to operate a standalone fiber to the home business, your outflows is the top yellow line. And what this shows is even after 20 years, you're still about $60 million shortfall. And this is really kind of shows the issue of a new provider coming that doesn't have these assets to leverage like an electric utility would have, but what type of obstacle they're facing to build fiber in some of these sparser rural areas. And so from that, maybe is there any questions on that? I know I want to be cognizant of the time here. We've got about 10 minutes left here too.
I think, Tom, maybe what we'll do is I'm doing my best to answer some of the questions.
Yep.
Why don't I let you kind of keep going, and I've teed up the ones that I have, and we'll try to pose those at the end then if we
Okay.
throw the material.
Sounds good. And so when I look at, kind of the strengths from the county, the government entities like the county, cities, and the state, I think one of them is that ability to potentially access grants. But also, I think if you're really looking at it, you could be looking at, maybe you look at issuing a grant yourself to help kind of turn the tables of the cost to build, especially with some of these smaller ISPs that might be looking at expanding out. Maybe there's some ways that you can help expedite permitting and right away access for fiber build. Or it could get down to looking at, when you look at that initial definition where we're talking about affordability, is there some way you can take a look and support some digital equity programs and education programs? You also have the ability, is there some economic development type of funds and drivers onto that? We're doing a project in Michigan right now. It's not they're leveraging some of the economic development funds from the federal government to help look at planning some fiber to the premises in some of the smaller communities. And another one is looking at, maybe there's some ways you can look to facilitate some consortium or associations. And there's one just outside of north of Madison, a small town, is looking at forming a co-op that will be the wireless service provider and taking funds to help kind of fund the co-op, and really kind of taking a different approach to a business model, onto that. So there's some, I think with the counties, it's a little bit different, maybe not just jumping into the business, but maybe taking a look at where some ways to help facilitate. And I think earlier mentioned that Taylor County was looking at like a middle mile type of approach to say, would that help encourage and take some of the barriers of entry to help encourage the ISPs? And we've seen that work in some cases where maybe what you end up doing is connecting the middle mile fiber to some towers, and then the towers can be then accessed by the wireless ISPs. And so you're taking some of the market barrier entries away from that. Some of the other considerations, if you take a look at one of the challenges between, if you look at like an electric utility, they can use their electric revenues to help finance pieces, where if you're going to help financing, you're typically probably going to be looking at general obligation bonding, which may at times require a voter approval on any type of GO bond funding. On the assets, you're primarily going on right away and permitting, versus like with an electric utility, they have the pole ownership. And again, on the cash flow, any short coverages, you got to be looking at tax dollars versus electric revenue. So from an electric utility standpoint, it's a little bit easier for them to look at some of these types of issues and how to approach them. And so maybe one of the things, excuse me, maybe one of the things that could be done is taking a look at with your local cooperative might be another partner to try to look at saying, how you might blend your needs and their needs together to kind of approach it more jointly onto it. And so in the some county type of roles, one of the things which I haven't really seen too much is the county really becoming a retail service provider, a wholesale service provider themselves. But we've seen more discussions around kind of some private-public partnership type of approaches, where maybe there's a middle mile open access infrastructure that's provided, leverage of tower assets and other types of assets that could be done. Maybe looking at the county promotion, sales assistance, those type of actions. You can also take a look at, is there types of tax incentives that you might be able to offer them through property taxes or other types of incentives. Maybe there's some type of low support, income support approach could be looked at. Maybe there's what I've seen in a couple of cases where the local government is providing some backstops for financial performance to help the provider You're not guaranteeing the loan, but you're guaranteeing a portion of the loan that they have to go out and borrow money on. You can look at the education of needs and issues, supply of tablets, laptops, and again, a lot of times you may have cases where you have service that's available, but your residences don't have the tools to be able to access those. And so maybe there's an education role that could do. And again, talking about maybe consortiums or grants and these other types of activities. So there's a variety of different ways that might be able to be looked at. One example here, kind of quickly, would be down in South Carolina, and this is kind of going into that middle mile fiber type of example. Whereas in the county, Oconee County, South Carolina, it's called in more of the mountain lakes region. It's in the far south east corner of the state, just north of Georgia, and then surrounded by Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And they obtained a VTOP grant back in 2009 for about 300, and they built about 350 miles of middle mile fiber throughout the county. And they went out and connected all the schools, fire stations, county facilities, federal facilities, and they were within about 4 to 5 miles, about 5 miles of every resident in the county. And what they did was they turned around and had a plan to offer backhaul and transport services to the ISPs, and especially with the internet service providers. Now, one of the challenges that they had was, even with that, was kind of maintaining cash flow on just maintaining the middle mile fiber. But one of the biggest challenges that they had was with their board oversight. And what I said with them was the county commission. And what the commissioners tended to do is to listen to a given citizen saying, hey, we need this building connected, and they would end up agreeing to it, and the county would have to go out and extend fiber to it. And they really didn't do a good job of being able to have the discipline to run this middle mile, even a middle mile project, as a business. And so what they really struggled with cash flow, and what they ended up doing in the end was they ended up doing a long-term lease of the fiber asset to a private ISP. And that helped address the cash flow issue, but more importantly, it kind of took the political oversight off from that. So I think that was so it's one that's turned out to be quite successful at this point in time, but it took them a little bit to kind of come up with the right mix that actually worked. But again, this was really kind of funded by a lot of the BTOP program to start with. And the last couple of points are just kind of really, if you kind of just general considerations, that I think one of the things that, the consumer choices are expanding, like we talked a little bit about some of the wireless and satellite options that are evolving. And I think if you're going to be looking at even a support role, making sure that you're prepared to look at how do you operate this as even in a partnership, taking a look at it a little bit more of like a business, thinking about it through a little bit more of a business. You also want to make sure that if you're really jumping into something, you want to make sure that you really understand all the different nuances. Especially when you jump into the partnership type discussions, a lot of partners will promise you a lot, but you really want to take a look at saying what your obligations really are under that partnership and who is really taking risk and not risk. And so you really want to kind of own all the details in that analysis. And then, any of the staff that's going to be involved, whether it's even kind of a digital equity type of support to a middle mile type project, you really want to make sure that your team and people that are going to be around it really understand all the different nuances there. And you really want to make sure that your board and commission, doesn't make that same mistake that happened here in Oconee County, where, that you end up running it as a, more politically than as a business type of piece. And then there may be some ways that even under a partnership of saying, how do you kind of slowly build out over time onto it and taking revenues, once you start generating positive revenues, then how do you reinvest those dollars to expand out the investments? And then again, partnerships, that we've talked a little bit about. And then taking a little bit, what are lessons learned from some of the other activities out there? And then if you're looking at some financial modeling, really make sure that you're looking at it more than just a spreadsheet. It's making sure that you understand really all the assumptions that really go into that. And so from that is maybe you can open it up for questions again here, Jim.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. And actually, I think I'll hand it back to Michelle. And Michelle, let you kind of guide us from here.
Absolutely. I think we are, gentlemen, at the hour mark here. We thank you so much for your time. As a reminder to participants, this presentation, and I believe Jim and Tom, if it's okay, we'll also link separately to your slides within that on the WCA YouTube channel. We'll also put it on the WCA homepage in case people need to see it there. That is wicounties.org. And we'll also put Tom and Jim's email as well on that. So if you have to follow up with any questions, they will have the answers for you. So thanks again, everyone, for participating today, and we will see you soon.